The wind cut across the Wyoming plains like a living thing, sharp and relentless, rattling the edges of the cabin where I had spent the last 10 years alone. I had gotten used to the emptiness, the way silence settled in corners like dust, the way the snow could choke the land for weeks, and you either fought it or surrendered. My name is Ethan Cole, and I hadn't known a woman's presence in this house since the day Clara died. 10 years. 10 winters of faithful grief. 10 years of keeping every letter, every photograph, every stitch of fabric exactly as she had left it. That night, the first shadow of a storm stretched across the horizon. I was patching the fence, leather hands raw, rope burns still stinging from a morning's work, when I saw movement at the edge of the yard. A figure, small against the vast expanse of snow, carrying herself with a kind of determination that immediately set my teeth on edge. She looked lost, desperate, but there was fire in her eyes. Brown, not Clara's familiar blue, but enough of her sister's spirit to make me pause mid-step. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I simply watched as she approached the cabin, dragging what looked like a carpet bag through the frost. She pushed the door open before I could even reach it, a quiet but daring intrusion into a decade of solitude. And then I saw her face, the golden streak of wind in her hair catching what little lamplight there was, and my chest tightened. This was not Clara. This was Elizabeth, Eliza, her sister, alive, breathless, and unmoored from the world she had fled. I stepped closer, boots heavy on the frozen wooden porch, and she flinched just enough to remind me she had learned nothing about Wyoming winters yet. My house smelled of lavender, of old wood, of years that had not moved past her sister's death. She took it all in with a gaze that seemed to measure the distance between the past and what could be, what she wanted and what I feared. "I don't belong here," she said, though not to me, and her words hung in the cold air. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that the land could be cruel but also kind if you knew how to survive it. But something about the set of her shoulders, the defiance in her small hands, reminded me too much of Clara's gentle courage. And yet, it was different, wilder, alive in ways that made me ache. By the time I realized it, I had opened the door for her. The cabin, for the first time in 10 years, was no longer empty. And just like that, the first shadow of something impossible settled over my heart. If you're watching this story unfold, drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. I love hearing from viewers around the world. And hit that like button if you're ready for a tale of love, loss, and the kind of danger that will make your heart race on the Wyoming frontier. The snow had begun in earnest by the time she settled at Clara's old kitchen table, a place I hadn't seen anyone occupy in over a decade. She was still shivering, brushing frost from her coat, and I realized how unprepared she was for Wyoming's merciless winters. I offered her the chair closest to the hearth, and she hesitated, as if afraid to warm herself in my presence, as if the heat could somehow burn her the way the past had burned us both. Her hands trembled as she opened Clara's diary, fingers tracing the words as though they could transport her into my world, into a life that had been carefully preserved for 10 years. I watched her silently, wondering if she understood the weight she carried simply by stepping inside this cabin. Every object, every photograph, every quilt had a story. Clara's story. And now, her sister was here, alive and vibrant, standing where no one had stood for a decade, daring to touch the remnants of the life I had preserved in mourning. It struck me then, painfully, how much I had avoided living, how much I had imprisoned myself in grief, and how dangerous it could be to let someone like her in. Yet the look in her eyes was unyielding, stubborn, demanding acknowledgement that life still existed beyond loss. She wasn't Clara, and yet she was something impossibly similar, something that made me want to hate her for her intrusion, but also something that made me ache for her presence. I moved silently to check the stove, coaxing a reluctant flame to life, feeling the warmth seep slowly into the cabin. She glanced at me then, her expression softening, her eyes meeting mine with a strange mixture of curiosity and caution, and I realized we were both measuring boundaries we weren't ready to cross. The diary lay open between us, and with each page she turned, I felt the stirrings of a long-forgotten tenderness, a vulnerability that was dangerous for both of us in this isolated wilderness. Days passed, and Eliza's presence slowly began to leave marks on the cabin, on me, and on the rhythm of a life I had thought frozen in time. She moved awkwardly at first, burning eggs, spilling beans, struggling with Clara's old wood stove, but each misstep carried a determination that was impossible to ignore. I found myself cleaning up after her silently, muttering under my breath about city girls who thought Wyoming could be tamed without sacrifice. Yet every time I caught her defiant glance, I felt a strange mix of admiration and fear. Admiration for her courage, fear of what letting her stay might awaken inside me. She didn't belong to this land, at least not yet, but she was stubborn, persistent, and impossibly alive. Watching her struggle with the isolation, the cold, the endless work of tending to the ranch, I realized she was fighting for something she barely understood, a sense of belonging, a connection to a sister she had lost long before, and maybe, unknowingly, to me. One morning, I found her in the barn, hands soft and unpracticed, attempting to milk a cow. The determination etched into her face made my chest ache in ways I hadn't felt since Clara's death. I moved closer, instinctively, my calloused hands guiding hers over the bucket, the scent of her hair and winter roses filling the small space. For a brief moment, the world outside, the blizzards, the snow, the pain of the past, disappeared. I almost forgot myself, almost forgot the walls I had built around my heart. Yet as quickly as the warmth came, it left. A fleeting glance at Clara's photograph above the mantel reminded me that some things were untouchable, some memories sacred, and some desires dangerous. And still, with every passing day, Eliza was weaving herself into the fabric of my life, whether I wanted it or not. The blizzard hit without warning, a white hell that swallowed the horizon and erased the familiar contours of the land I had tended for years. The wind screamed like a living thing, rattling the cabin windows, pressing the cold into every corner, and I knew instinctively that it would test us both. Eliza had never faced Wyoming winters, and yet there she was, struggling into Clara's heavy coat, determined to prove herself capable. I watched her from the doorway, heart hammering, knowing how foolish it was to let her go out into the storm, yet unable to deny the stubborn spark I recognized in her eyes. By the time we reached the cattle, they were scattered, half frozen in a draw 2 miles south. Every step through the deep snow was a battle, every gust of wind a reminder of how unforgiving this land could be. I shouted directions, my voice barely carrying, and Eliza's soft words of encouragement were lost in the roar around us. Yet she refused to retreat, refusing to surrender, proving that she belonged to this place in ways she hadn't yet admitted, even to herself. When we finally corralled the cattle and drove them back to the cabin, her hands were blue and trembling, and I built the fire as quickly as I could, making coffee laced with whiskey to warm her from the inside. She sat wrapped in quilts, still shivering, yet her eyes held a strange pride, a stubborn light that mirrored the storm outside. I realized then that she had changed something inside me, something I thought had been dead with Clara. She looked at me, exhausted but unbroken, and I knew that what I was feeling, this dangerous, impossible pull, was no longer something I could deny. Eliza was here, and the storm outside mirrored the storm awakening between us, fierce and unrelenting, impossible to ignore. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across the walls, and I watched her move, careful and deliberate, yet unpracticed in ways that made my chest tighten. She was learning, slowly, how to survive in this land that had once belonged only to men like me. Each small victory, boiling water without spilling, lighting the stove without burning herself, was a triumph, and with each one, I found my admiration growing, mixed with a dangerous curiosity I hadn't felt in years. Her presence challenged the careful solitude I had cultivated, reminding me of the life I had abandoned when grief had swallowed me whole. She carried with her the energy of someone unbroken by circumstance, someone willing to fight for a place that wasn't hers by birth, but by determination. I wanted to warn her of the dangers, to shield her from the harshness of Wyoming winters, from the loneliness that clawed at my soul, but I also wanted to watch her prove she could endure it all. At dawn, I found her in the barn again, hands coated with frost as she tended the animals, and a strange, fierce pride surged through me. There was something intoxicating about her resilience, the way she refused to be intimidated by this land, by me, or by the memory of the sister she had come to honor. And yet, with every glance, every smile, I felt the weight of the past pressing down, the ghost of Clara, the memory of love that had defined my life, and the danger of giving my heart to someone who didn't belong in this story yet. Still, when our eyes met, I felt something undeniable, a current of desire and fear intertwining. It was both thrilling and terrifying, this attraction that defied reason, this connection forged in snow and silence, in risk and quiet victories. The fire crackled between us, but the tension, the unspoken longing, burned hotter. The calm was shattered one Tuesday when the hoofbeats came thundering across the frozen prairie. I was in town fetching supplies, leaving the cabin unusually quiet, and Eliza saw them first. Two men, riding with the confidence of predators, approaching with easy familiarity, the kind of men who took what they wanted without asking. Her pulse raced, and instinctively, she moved toward the Winchester I kept above the mantel, hands shaking as she checked the chamber. 5 bullets, nothing more, and a resolve that belied her inexperience. The front door exploded inward with a crash that sent splinters across Clara's once pristine floors. The taller of the two men stepped through, tipping his hat with a false courtesy that made her stomach twist. He moved with deliberate menace, his eyes scanning her like she was prey. The shorter one followed, scarred and mean-looking, the kind of man whose grin promised pain. She held the rifle like I had shown her, a stance half-learned, and yet it carried the weight of courage born of necessity. The room filled with tension, the air sharp and cold, mingling with the snow still clinging to her coat. Each breath, each movement, was a test of nerve, of skill, of will. When the first shot rang out, deafening in the cabin, it splintered the doorframe inches from the taller man's head. For a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. Adrenaline surged through her veins, shaking her hands, sharpening her senses, turning fear into a weapon. By the time I arrived, boots thundering on the porch, her bravery had already staved off disaster, though barely. The scarred man's pistol had gone flying, taking 2 fingers with it, the taller one limping and cursing. She stood trembling but unbowed, the Winchester still clutched in white-knuckled hands, eyes wide with fear and triumph. And I realized then that she had already become something I hadn't anticipated, a force as wild and unyielding as the land itself. I stepped into the cabin, boots heavy on the wooden floor, and for a brief moment the world narrowed to her trembling hands, the Winchester still held like a shield, and the chaos of the intruders barely escaping into the snow. My heart hammered, not from anger at the men, but from the sight of her standing there, alive, unbroken, yet exposed in a way that made me feel both protective and dangerously aware of the stirrings inside me I had long suppressed. She looked at me, and I could see it, the recognition that we were no longer merely two people occupying the same space. Something had shifted during those frantic moments, a bond forged in fear, in shared peril, in the quiet thrill of survival. I wanted to hold her, to assure her, but the memory of Clara sat heavy above the mantel, her painted eyes a reminder that some desires were forbidden, some loyalties eternal. And yet, I couldn't look away. Her courage, her stubbornness, the way she had faced danger without flinching, it pulled at something deep inside me, something I had tried to bury beneath 10 years of faithful grief. I made coffee for both of us, strong and bitter, and for a moment we sat in silence, the room filled with the scent of fire and wet wool and adrenaline still lingering in the air. She didn't speak, but her glance told me enough. She had tested herself, tested the land, and tested me, and in doing so, she had entered a world I thought no one else could inhabit. I realized then that letting her into my life wasn't just a risk, It was a reckoning. And as the wind rattled the windows, I understood something I had refused to admit for years. She was changing the rhythm of my heart, whether I allowed it or not. The nights in Wyoming were long, colder than I remembered, and somehow lonelier with her presence in the cabin. Yet her presence brought warmth, a dangerous, intoxicating warmth that made the old grief in my chest stir and twist into something I hadn't felt in 10 years. I caught myself watching her move around the kitchen, how she handled Clara's belongings with a mixture of reverence and curiosity, and the ache in my chest reminded me that desire could exist alongside respect and guilt. Eliza didn't know how close she had come to changing my world entirely. Every laugh, every clumsy attempt to cook or mend the fence, pulled me closer to the edge of something I hadn't dared approach since Clara's death. And every glance she threw my way, bright with unspoken questions, reminded me that she was unaware of the battle raging inside me, the fight between loyalty to the memory of my wife and the raw, uncontainable pull toward her. I found myself lingering behind her in the barn, inhaling the scent of roses and winter air clinging to her hair, guiding her hands over the buckets and ropes, pretending it was instruction, while the truth was far more dangerous. I shouldn't feel this, couldn't let myself, and yet every heartbeat made it harder to deny the reality I had long tried to bury. She looked up at me then, eyes wide, and I almost faltered, almost let my resolve slip. She was alive, stubborn, brave, and entirely unprepared for the power she had over me. And I understood in that instant, as frost clung to our boots and snow whipped past the barn walls, that some desires could not be contained, even when they were dangerous, forbidden, or impossible. The calm of Wyoming's plains shattered again, this time with the distant rattle of hooves and the unmistakable threat of strangers seeking trouble. I had thought the last encounter had been a warning, but the sight of them riding across the snow, faces obscured by scarves and hatred in their eyes, reminded me that danger had a way of finding those who tried to bury it. Eliza saw them first, tension pulling her taut, and I could feel her fear mingling with a courage I had never known before. She grabbed the Winchester instinctively, hands still shaking, heart racing against the walls of the cabin, and I knew the test we faced now would not just be of skill, but of trust, of survival, and of the fragile connection we had built. The cabin became a storm's eye, the air tight with anticipation, every creak of the floorboard, every whisper of the wind outside, a countdown to the inevitable. She held the rifle steady, the weight unfamiliar, the recoil a threat, but determination hardened her. And I realized that in this isolated place, with death a possibility just beyond the walls, she had already proven herself, not just to me, but to herself. When the first shot rang out, deafening in the small cabin, I felt it in my bones, the sharp, urgent reminder that the frontier did not forgive hesitation. And yet, even in the chaos, I saw her bravery, raw and unpolished, and it stirred something impossible inside me. Fear, yes, but also an undeniable pull of desire, a longing I had buried beneath 10 years of loss. By the time the threat passed, we were both breathless, hearts hammering, the snow outside silent once more. I stood close enough to feel her warmth, to notice the slight trembling in her hands, the wide, searching eyes. And I knew then that nothing could undo what had begun. Our connection, forged in fear, courage, and winter's cruelty, was unstoppable, even if forbidden. The fire in the cabin cast shadows across her face, illuminating the fine lines of tension, the flush of adrenaline, and the unspoken questions that hung between us. I wanted to reach for her, to close the distance, but Clara's photograph watched me from the mantel, eyes painted forever in judgment and love, a reminder that some promises should never be broken. And yet, as I felt her warmth, smelled the faint scent of winter roses and determination clinging to her hair, I realized that desire doesn't wait for permission. It crashes through walls, through years of grief, and through every carefully constructed barrier. We stood close, close enough that I could see every hesitation, every flicker of doubt in her brown eyes, and I understood the peril we faced. Not from the land, nor from the storms, nor even from strangers who had threatened us before, but from ourselves, from the past, from the ghosts of a love I had vowed never to betray. Her hand brushed mine, accidental or not, and my chest tightened, every muscle coiled between restraint and surrender. The snow outside pressed against the windows, relentless, reminding me that the world beyond this cabin didn't forgive mistakes, didn't wait for confessions, and didn't yield to desire. And still, here she was, alive, fearless in her own way, challenging me, drawing me into a storm of longing and guilt I hadn't felt in a decade. I realized then, as the fire crackled and her gaze held mine, that we were at the edge of something irreversible. Every heartbeat screamed that we could lose ourselves entirely, or that we could finally, impossibly, find something worth living for again. Morning came, pale and sharp, cutting across the Wyoming plains with a light that revealed every curve of snow, every shadow of the prairie. I saddled my horse, heart heavy with the knowledge that she had left me a note. Eliza had decided to leave, to escape the impossible tangle of loyalty, grief, and desire that bound us. She had written 3 simple lines, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Gratitude, sorrow, and resignation. The train to Cheyenne would take her away from this land, away from me, and I felt the ache of inevitability crushing against my ribs. I couldn't let her go. 10 years of grief had taught me the cost of silence, the pain of love unspoken, and the futility of waiting. I pushed my horse hard across the frozen prairie, hooves striking sparks from ice, the wind tearing at my coat, and every mile shrank the distance between us and the life she deserved. When I arrived at the depot, the eastbound train hissed, smoke curling against the morning sky. She stood there, small against the steel and steam, carpetbag in hand, searching for courage as if the horizon itself could give her permission to leave. She saw me first. Her eyes widened, a flash of hope and fear, and in that instant, all the barriers, the ghosts, the grief, they fell away. I reached for her hand, and she took it, the cold metal of the train irrelevant, the vast expanse of Wyoming nothing compared to the pull between us. We didn't need words. The distance we had traversed, the storms, the fear, the longing, culminated in that single touch. Her fingers laced with mine, a promise that neither the past nor the world beyond the prairie could undo. As the train disappeared into the horizon, carrying other lives away, we stood together, 2 figures against an endless sky. Wyoming stretched before us, wild, unforgiving, but alive, full of possibility. And I understood finally that love, like the land, could survive storms, grief, and even the ghosts of those who came before. We had found it in each other, and nothing, no snow, no shadow, no memory, could take it away. If this story touched your heart, drop a like and tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Remember, second chances are rare, but sometimes they're all that really matter.